This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference. Today's call is on the toll of Alaska's coal, health impacts from coal export. We're joined today by three guest presenters, Dr. Stephen Gilbert of the Institute of Neurotoxicology and Neurological Disorders, Regna Merritt of Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, and Heidi Zimmer of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information on the websites akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. The call will last 1 hour, and during the presentations, everyone is muted, and at the end, there will be an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment. You might be wanting to think of those questions as our presenters present. Everyone who signed up for the call by the end of the day yesterday should have received an email this morning with a link to the call webpage where you will find speaker presentations, and all three of our speakers today have presentation slides. If you didn't receive the link or don't have it in front of you, you can go to the Alaska Community Action on Toxics homepage at akaction.org. Simply click on the title of today's call, which you will find in the upper left of the homepage, and this will bring you to the call webpage. We will begin with a brief overview of coal in Alaska, followed by a discussion of the health impacts of coal mining and transportation, and we'll conclude with a bigger picture look at health impacts from climate change. And as a reminder to our presenters, if as you're going through your slides, you can just reference the slide number or the title of the slide every once in a while in case someone joined late and is trying to catch up to where you are in your presentation. That would be very helpful. To begin, I would like to introduce Heidi Zimmer, Environmental Health and Justice Coordinator for Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Heidi is a lifelong Alaska resident who holds a master's degree in environmental science from Western Washington University and a bachelor's degree in biology and English. Prior to joining ACAT, Heidi worked as an environmental scientist for a private consulting firm and for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as a habitat biologist. Welcome, Heidi. Would you like to begin?
Yes, thanks, Diana, for that intro. So this is Heidi Zimmer, and our speakers today will be talking about health issues stemming from mining and transporting coal for export. And since both Ms. Merritt and Dr. Gilbert will be referring primarily to their work in Washington and Oregon, I'd like to just start us off with a quick overview of proposed mines and transport routes here in Alaska. So slide 2 of my presentation is a map of Alaska with a whole lot of black on it. That shows the coal reserves in Alaska. The black areas are the coal reserves still underground, which total about 1/8 of the world's reserves by general estimates. And if all of Alaska's coal were mined and burned, the CO2 emissions alone from this would put the planet well past the tipping point for climate change. I believe Regna will talk more about that later. The reddish blotches on this map scattered across it indicate either proposed or active coal mines, and the yellow X's indicate proposed or active export facilities. So right now, the only active coal mine in Alaska is in Healy, which is right up in the middle of the state. And about half of the coal mined at Healy goes by rail up to power plants in the Fairbanks area. And the other half, which is about 1 million tons per year, goes by rail south through Wasilla and Anchorage to the only active export facility down in Seward. So everything else on this map is a proposed mine or facility, and so far all of the coal from new mines is slated for export. And this could change a little bit, but not by a whole lot, because Alaska currently gets only 10% of its energy generation from coal, so there really is not much domestic market. So next slide. Slide 3 is just a closer view of the Cook Inlet watershed, and Seward, down to the south, is the export facility in the lower right. And it is already operating pretty close to capacity with the coal that it gets from Healy. So the other two export facilities listed on here are likely to come into play. So the big X on the left across Cook Inlet from Kenai is Chuitna, and there's a proposed strip mine and export facility. And nothing is there, nothing is built there right now. It's just a beautiful salmon stream and some coastal sitnet sites. And the third one is Port McKenzie, kind of up in the top middle, and it's about 2 miles across Cook Inlet from Anchorage. And this port has been built but is not yet exporting any coal. But Port McKenzie is important because it's likely the port used for export for the 3 proposed coal mines in the Matanuska Valley, just east of Palmer. So next slide, slide 4, titled Matanuska Valley Coal Footprint, is again a closer up showing the 3 coal mines proposed for the Matanuska Valley, and these are all in various stages of the permitting process. Wishbone Hill is the big blotch in red right in the middle near Sutton. Wishbone Hill is the only mine so far that actually has an operations plan that includes likely transportation routes. The other 2 are Jonesville Mine, that's a little patch of yellow tucked up next to Wishbone Hill, and then over to the east, the Mental Health Trust's Chickaloon lease, that's the purple patch out by Chickaloon. Jonesville and Chickaloon are still in the exploration phase, so we know quite a bit less about their exact transportation plans. And then the brown patches scattered across the map are other areas of Mental Health Trust land, and some of these could potentially be leased for coal in the future. Next slide, slide 5, the heavy blue line kind of running diagonally across that shows the planned transportation route for trucking coal from Wishbone Hill over to Port McKenzie. And the mine plan for Wishbone Hill indicates nearly 100 one-way semi-truck trips per day down the Glen Highway through or near Palmer and Wasilla, and then out a 2-lane road, Goose Bay Highway, and out to the port. And the pictures they added in there are of a couple of coal truck accidents that have happened in the lower 48. I put those in to illustrate the risk of accidents with the increased semi-truck traffic on congested roads. This has been a big concern by a variety of folks in the Mat-Su Valley when we've been talking about these proposed mines. And then slide 6, the next one shows an alternate future option for coal transportation. This is the planned Port McKenzie rail spur. And on this map, this section from Houston around Big Lake to Port McKenzie is the planned but not existing rail spur. The main reason to build this rail line is to move Usabelli's coal to the port and on to export. And this project is still a few years out, so meanwhile, coal would still be trucked to the port. And then even with the rail spur, trucks would still be needed to bring the coal from the mines to the nearest railroad depot in Palmer. And then finally, slide 7, toxic trade. This shows the bigger picture regionally. And the biggest export market for Alaska coal is across the Pacific in China, Korea, and other Asian countries. So Alaska coal would be shipped over across the Pacific, burned in power plants overseas. And then the emissions from burning coal overseas form a brown cloud that takes about a week to blow back to Alaska, where pollutants, including mercury, begin to settle out in Alaskan waters. And the primary source of mercury in Alaska fish, even now, is industrial emissions from overseas. So again, this is a big concern for Alaskans. So these are the coal mines and infrastructure that we're facing that are planned for Alaska. So I'll go ahead and hand this back over to Dr. Gilbert to tell us what effect this might have on our health.
Thank you, Heidi, for a great introduction. And now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Stephen Gilbert. And Dr. Gilbert is director and founder of the Institute of Neurotoxicology and Neurological Disorders and an affiliate professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences at the University of Washington. He has a PhD in toxicology and is a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology. Dr. Gilbert's research is focused on neurobehavioral effects of low-level exposure to lead and mercury on the developing nervous system. His book, A Small Dose of Toxicology, The Health Effects of Common Chemicals, was published in 2004, and the second edition is available for free as an ebook, and he'll tell you how to access that. He recently started the wiki-based website Toxipedia, which includes a suite of sites that put scientific information in the context of history, society, and culture. Welcome, Steve. Would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for that nice, kind introduction. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining the call today. I always really appreciate it with LASA CHE community. I think you guys do a great job up there. I'm part of the Washington State CHE work down here. Like Diana said, my work is mostly focused on trying to make information accessible and use the information we have to make better decisions. Coal and the health effects of coal are one of those opportunities where we know a lot about the issues, and I think we need to make better decisions given the knowledge we already have. So I hope everybody's got the slides up. On the second slide, the slides are numbered in the bottom right-hand corner. And that the second slide is the United States is the Saudi Arabia of coal. And that's probably really true. I was really stunned to see how much coal is actually in Alaska. I was not aware of that. In Washington State, we're concerned about the Powder River Basin in Montana. But the issue is the United States is looking all over the world to export coal. And what are the consequences of doing that, both from any aspect of coal is not a clean product. Next slide, slide 3, sort of shows the life cycle of coal. Whether it's mountaintop removal or mining of coal, it has serious effects on deforestation, water contamination, and potential cancer from occupational exposure, as well as exposure to communities around it. Transportation of coal, it's really amazing that 70% of all U.S. rail traffic is associated with coal, and in Alaska, a lot of the truck traffic could be associated with coal transportation also. The burning of coal has its own problems, whether it's nitrous oxides or sulfur dioxides, ozone, and serious implications of particulate matter. It was always mentioned that mercury in coal is a serious problem, and that gets into the water supply. It shows up in the fish, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Ash waste is also an issue in the burning of coal. So arsenic and lead in the ash waste. Arsenic is particularly serious because it can contaminate the water supply. Storage ponds, you might remember the Great Break in Tennessee. Storage ponds broke and contaminated large acres of land and waterways. So coal is not clean from start to finish. As slide 4 just emphasized again, whether it's mining of coal or the mountaintop removal or combustion of coal or transportation of coal, all have this different issues that we need to be concerned about, both from environmental consequences and also the health effects. That's why I'm very much an opponent of doing health environmental assessments, not just environmental assessments, but looking at health consequences of the mining, transportation, combustion, and disposal of waste from coal. The next slide, slide 5, is why is this an issue? Why is this an issue? Significant amounts of airborne pollutants is a really big issue, as you saw from that nice slide about burning of coal in China. It has global implications, toxic chemicals used to control the dust. This has been an issue for railroad transportation, but I'm sure it's also an issue for truck transportation of coal. I've looked into a little bit of the chemicals that are using. I cannot find much information. So it's spray chemicals on top of the coal to control the dust. Remember, on these long train rides of coal, they can lose 500 to 1,000 pounds of coal dust off these trains for each car. So it's really pretty significant loss of material. And some of these dust control measures are nanotechnology products, which it's not clear to me if anybody's really looked too closely at that. So and then you have increased potential for train derailment, emergency response from blocked roadways, and a lot of this stuff will translate into trucks. Also, increased train and ship traffic. What are the consequences of that? The trains have diesel engines on them. The ships also. Delays that occur along the transportation route to increase noise pollution. I'm going to show this slide again, just to emphasize the transportation of coal. It's a long route, and whether they're building railroad spurs, there's truck traffic. It's going to be significant, both from potential hazards and accidents along the way, along the transportation route, and who's exposed along those routes. I think it's very important to consider the transportation routes and who lives along those routes. The next slide looks at coal's assault on human health, and to look at that, 4 of the 5 leading causes of mortality in the United States are associated with coal pollutants. Those are heart disease, cancer, stroke, and chronic respiratory disease. All these diseases increase with coal dust exposure and diesel exhaust exposure. These are some of the heavy metals, and I just review a few of them. At the end of this talk, I won't have time to go through them all. I added some extra slides so you can look in more detail at some of the potential health consequences of the different contaminants in coal. Lead is an important one. This is one of my concerns, is lead and mercury, because children absorb 50% of the lead they're exposed to. This is in contrast to adults that only absorb 10%. So children are more vulnerable than adults from a variety of measures. Just this one example of lead absorption is an important one, and the consequence of very low-level lead exposure development to the nervous system, particularly for kids, is significant. And there's really no safe level of lead exposure. The Center for Disease Control has just lowered the action level of blood lead from 10 to 5 micrograms per deciliter. In my own opinion, it should be below 2. Mercury is important for contaminating the most important food source, which is fish, but you can inhale mercury or ingest it, so the mercury moves into the water supply and is turned into methylmercury. Beryllium is another contaminant, serious lung consequences of beryllium inhalation, potential for cancer. And arsenic is an important one in coal. Like I mentioned, it contaminates coal dust in higher concentrations, which can leach into the groundwater, contaminate the groundwater, but it's also in the dust that comes off the trains and trucks. The next slide, slide 9, just a little cartoon about mercury and the movement of mercury. I think it's important to consider mercury because it does readily contaminate the water supply. It moves from the bacteria trying to decontaminate mercury or detoxify mercury. It changes it into methylmercury, where it readily moves up the food chain, contaminating fish. And the challenge is dealing with the coal as it's burned. But really, when you ship this coal to China or India, the trade winds blow the mercury and other contaminants over toward the United States and lower 48, as well as Alaska. And you see in the background there is the coal plant, that electric power generating station. And we know somewhat how to control the mercury effluent from the coal plant. The challenge is getting the coal producers to put the pollution control devices on the plant, because pollution control devices do not make the coal plant operators any money. So it's a challenge to get them to use the current technology. In Washington State, we worked to shut down the Centralia coal-fired utility plant, in part because they were not controlling the mercury effluent or putting more than 400 pounds of mercury into the atmosphere every year. That plant's due to be shut down in 2025. Next slide is a figure I just got showing the mercury emissions. And it's really striking that Asia is 65% of the mercury emissions, and you can see the other countries around, areas around the globe. But mercury coming out of Asia is largely associated with the coal-fired utility plants. So I think we really have to ask ourselves, do we really want to ship more coal that's going to end up contaminating the world, contributing to global warming, as well as contamination of the fish supply with mercury and a contamination of our own waterways? The next slide, slide 11, just shows some of the areas I just want to touch on briefly. Respiratory, cardiovascular, neurological, and these are all the areas, the prime areas we have to think about as the health consequences of coal, both from the diesel exhaust emissions and the coal dust, as well as the consequences of burning coal. Look at respiratory issues. Asthma is probably the most direct one. These are made of these contaminants from coal dust to the diesel exhaust are asthma triggers that can cause chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, stunt lung development. And again, it's back to children. They breathe more than adults do. Their lungs are smaller, more susceptible to damage, and infant mortality increases. Colds, pneumonia more likely, and also down the road, potential lung cancer. Cardiovascular disease, there's a great deal of research going on, the small particulate matter, increasing heart attacks and causing other cardiac arrhythmias, congestive heart failure. A lot of work's going on actually at the University of Washington in Seattle here on small particulate matter and nanoparticles in diesel exhaust. Nervous system, you have increased likelihood of strokes, cerebral vascular diseases, and loss of intellectual capacity. And we don't need any loss of intellectual capacity in our world, particularly given the problems we have to solve. And why more vulnerable? Who's most vulnerable? I think this is really important to ask, is who are the most vulnerable? And we cannot just look at the 170-pound white male and do our health assessments. We have to ask who is most vulnerable, whether it's children, elderly, those with pre-existing lung conditions, people with asthma, diabetes, heart disease, women over 50, and workers. Workers are a very important aspect of this, whether it's in the coal plant or the coal mines, or it's in the shipping terminals. I just want to emphasize again, my interest has been child health for a long time and protecting children. Children are not little adults. They eat more, breathe more, and drink more per body weight than adults do. And a small exposure means a big dose because they're small body weight. And the impact of health-related exposures is greater than adults. for the developing nervous system, for example, the connections being made. It's important to protect children's health. A little quote about that, I think that we have an ethical responsibility to ensure that conditions that ensure that all living things have the best opportunity to reach and maintain their full potential. And when you expose kids to lead, mercury, or other contaminants, you're really robbing them of their potential. This actually goes for other organisms too. If you dump a coal train into a creek, you can destroy the salmon and you harm the potential of other organisms to reproduce and reach their potential also. So I think it's very important for us to consider the implications of our action for not just us, but also future generations and our children. I just can't help but mention what I consider the first bioethicist, Aldo Leopold, who said a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. I would argue that shipping coal long distances to be burned in another country really does not preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It generally degrades it from many different perspectives, and it's wrong. So just a couple other issues around the coal transportation routes is noise. And we know that noise contributes to cardiovascular disease, increased blood pressure, lack of sleep, cognitive impairment in children, and increase in general in stress. And we know from other research that stress combined with exposure to other contaminants, such as lead or mercury, increases the effects of these contaminants. So stress is an important contributor and exacerbates problems with other contaminants. So stress is an important factor. This could be a stressful situation too, where you need an ambulance, you can't get by, so the railroad crossing is jammed up with cars or trains crossing it. And these trains can be over a mile long. There was just an incident where one of the train wheels got stuck and it jammed up a railroad crossing for over an hour. And of course, you've got potential train accidents. Many of the rail transportation routes go along rivers and streams. One of these cars, or many of these cars, tip over, contaminated a stream. You've got a big cleanup problem. And what are the consequences of that for the fish and other wildlife in the area? And of course, we had a little bit about truck accidents, whether it's on a major roadway, and there will be accidents. There's just no doubt about that. And what are the consequences of that, whether it's on the roadway, potentially in a stream, what's going to happen there? And the bottom right, I just put that one in there because this is not an accident, but it's certainly a contaminant. It's certainly contributing to contamination in the air, and it's really another issue with truck traffic. And the coal dust, just a quick look at coal dust. And we know a lot about coal dust, mostly from mining, but there's a lot of coal dust that comes off those coal cars and trucks, and that dust can be picked up, hand-to-mouth behavior of children. It's very important to consider that with contaminants in that dust increases contamination of the ground. Dust gets tracked into the home, and who's on the ground but playing but kids, so they have more hand-to-mouth behavior. And you ultimately have increased risk of death from cardiovascular disease, lung disease, hospitalization from asthma, particularly with children, slow growth of lung function, and increased mortality. So again, it's some of this is back to children, but we all should be concerned about where the dust is going and who is exposed to that coal dust and the particulates from diesel exhaust. Coming back to diesel exhaust, there have been several studies in the Seattle, Washington area here. Diesel emissions remain the largest contributor to potential cancer risk in Puget Sound area. And this is because of the soot. There's many contaminants in that soot, and there are also fine, small particulate matters, and nanotechnology comes into play here. Diesel exhaust is associated with a known carcinogen, the risk of lung and bladder cancers, risk of death from cardiovascular diseases. Occupational hazards shows that truckers, the rail workers, and miners using diesel exhaust-powered equipment. Diesel exhaust contain these small particulate matters, these nanoparticles. These small particles are very important because they travel deep into the lung. They also, because of their small size and large surface area, relative to their size, they attract other toxicants. So on these small particles are other chemicals, PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and other contaminants that reach into the body and can be absorbed from the lungs or directly into the blood system. And they are a trigger for heart attack and asthma. And we have to ask who lives along these routes, and is it an environmental justice issue? And always remember, children are generally affected more because of their small size. And this is from a study in Washington State Department of Ecology looking at the ports, an increase in fatal heart attacks, heart disease, bronchitis, chronic pulmonary diseases, pneumonia, emergency room visits to asthma. So there's a lot of indirect costs. And I think these are the things we have to account for. What are the true costs of shipping, transporting, and mining coal? And often we just maybe look at the environmental consequences of it, damming of streams, but what are the true costs of society? Because we externalize this cost out onto the public. And then there's greenhouse gases, and we'll hear more about that, but this is a serious issue. In the United States, coal-fired utility plants produce 27% of U.S. emissions and are projected to grow to a third by 2025. And this has got long-term consequences. It's the same thing with China. They plan to burn more and more coal. What are the global consequences? The global warming, climate change issues are huge here, and we really got to be thinking about that. Do we really want to contribute to these problems by shipping coal out of the United States? So I ask you all to sit there and think for a second. Do you live near a train track or a truck route? And what is going to be the consequences to your lifestyle? What are the issues about noise? And these trucks are going to be going 24/7 in and out, as well as the rail lines in and out of the cities. In our area, the big trains would travel right through Seattle, right through major urban areas. An environmental justice issue, I'll give a reference for this at the end, but these are very important to think about who lives along these transportation routes, who's there, what children are there, and what are the consequences of that to those people on this transportation route who suffer the most vulnerability, the most health effects, and the biggest consequences, and they make no gain from shipping this coal. They are not participating in the economic upside of this, however small that might be. And I just want to mention the precautionary principle because I'm a proponent that we need to take a precautionary approach to managing the coal, mining, transportation, and burning. This precautionary principle says when activity raises threats, so just raising threats of harm to human health or the environment, precaution measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationship are not fully established. So even if we're not positive, we need to take action. The burden of responsibility must be on the proponents of an activity to demonstrate safety. We should not be in the position of trying to show harm when they should have the burden of demonstrating safety. I spent years doing research on lead and mercury trying to demonstrate harm, and the industry should have been trying to demonstrate the safety of their product, which was not the case where the lead was added to gasoline or to our paint. And so how can you be involved? There's many ways to be involved. You can advocate, so we're on slide 32, advocate for testing, testifying, write letters to the editor, very important. Being involved in calls like this is really important, and it's really pushing for health impact assessments. HIA, I've been working with the Whatcom Docs in Bellingham about this. We just filed questions about briefing statements coming up, and Physicians for Social Responsibility, both in Washington, PSR, and the national, been working on this, as long as other organizations. Here's some of the national, the mercury and air toxic standards have come out, and there was just a national treaty of mercury trying to control mercury emissions worldwide, which is a huge effort, but didn't quite go far enough. TransAlta, the coal plant I mentioned that was being closed down in Washington State. Sierra Club has done a lot of work on coal, and both national and local PSR groups. And these are some of the other things you can do and some of the local events that are coming up and some online resources, the Sierra Club, PSR, Coal Trains Pass, Power Pass Coal, both really good sites that address the consequences of coal transportation and use. I just want to mention my book, Small Dose of Toxicology, has chapters on lead, arsenic, and many other contaminants, mercury, for example. It's a free ebook now. You can go to the www.asmalldoseof.org, and you can actually download individual chapters. Each chapter also has a PowerPoint presentation. If you email, I'm happy to donate or give you this PowerPoint presentation. Coal ash is a toxic threat to our health and environment. With the PSR document I worked on with Earth Justice, this, although it's focused on coal ash, there's a lot of good information about the health consequences of contaminants in coal. Silent Epidemic just came out, Hidden Threats to Health by Alan Lockwood, longtime PSR member. It's an excellent book. You should be in Washington State and Oregon in March. Perhaps you can come up to Alaska. And I really urge you to take a look at Cold-Blooded, Putting Profits for People. And this is an environmental justice document that looks at coal and the burning of coal. Quite a good document. And Toxipedia, please take a look at Toxipedia, where we try to put information in context of history, society, and culture. We'll take questions at the end, but I also wanted to mention again that there's a number of slides I don't have time to go through in the back part of the slide presentation you can look over. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate your taking your time to look into this coal issue. Thank you.
Wow, Steve. Thank you for your excellent presentation and for covering so much important material in a relatively short time. That will definitely leave some time for questions for people to ask more about the various health consequences and other considerations that you brought up.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Too fast.
No, it was great. Next, I would like to welcome Regna Merritt. Regna is the Prevent Coal Exports Campaign Director for Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. Regna works with health professionals and the Power Past Coal Coalition to identify and prevent negative health impacts of proposed coal export projects in the Pacific Northwest. A retired physician assistant and former executive director of Oregon WILD, Regna has worked for over 20 years to protect municipal drinking water. She was instrumental in efforts to secure federal legislation which protects the Bull Run, source of the largest municipal water supply in Oregon. Ms. Merritt graduated from U.S. Public Health Services Physician Assistant Training Program and received her Bachelor of Science from State University of New York. And welcome, Regna. Would you like to begin?
Thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here and to represent Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. Right off the bat, I'd like to thank Dr. Andy Harris and Dr. Wendy Ring for their academic support of this presentation. A new Greenpeace study just released yesterday ranked the proposed Northwest coal export terminals as the 5th dirtiest proposed energy project in the world. These projects come ranked under Arctic oil drilling, but above U.S. fracking and drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. It finds that the increased coal use they would facilitate would, by 2020, dump some 460 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. This reinforces the concerns of our governor, Oregon Governor Kit Saber, who wrote to the U.S. Army Corps and the BLM in April of last year, quote, "The impacts of U.S. coal exports on climate change are an issue of national concern that merits a hard look by a federal agency," unquote. Slide 2. These projects will have a huge impact on human health. Slide 3. Let's take a look at extreme weather events. They result in dislocation, disease, and death. In the U.S., just since 2005, over 7 million people have been evacuated from their homes due to extreme weather events. One big lesson that we learned from Katrina was that the biggest health impact was not drowning, but that people with chronic diseases became ill because they did not have access to their medicines, and they were disconnected from their usual source of medical care. Additionally, there were outbreaks of communicable diseases in shelters where people were forced to live in close quarters. Worldwide, environmental events now create more refugees than war and genocide. Slide 4. With climate change, we're seeing heavier rains, which contribute to flooding. There are clear trends toward more very heavy precip for the nation, including a 16% increase predicted for Oregon and Washington, and a 23% increase for Alaska. One hazard of flooding is leptospirosis, a disease that causes hepatitis and kidney failure. It's transmitted to humans when floodwaters are contaminated by the urine of infected animals, including domestic pets, livestock, and wild mammals. Next slide. Where it's not too wet, it's too dry. In 2012, over 60% of the U.S. was in moderate to severe drought. The past 2 summers have seen the worst drought in 50 years with combined crop losses of $30 billion. And the health impacts? Stress on farmers has increased the rate of male suicide. Drought also leads to increased prices and increased food insecurity, which adversely affects the health of our most vulnerable populations. Slide 6. Here's the range of temperature increase predicted for 2100, between 3.2 and 11.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Extreme heat causes more deaths than any other type of extreme weather event. A heat wave in Europe in 2003 led to 70,000 deaths. In California in 2006, we saw over 2 weeks' time 600 deaths, 1,600 hospitalizations, and 16,000 ER visits. In Russia in 2010, heat plus wildfire killed 56,000 people. The average number of extreme heat days is predicted to be 8 times higher by the end of this century. Heat-related mortality is predicted to at least quadruple by 2050. Slide 7. We're seeing rising sea levels. Slide 8. Coastal flooding is going to become more frequent and storm surges more severe due to sea level rise and an increase in the power of storms fueled by warmer ocean temperatures. Drowning during a storm surge is the most frequent cause of death from hurricanes, followed by trauma from falling storm debris. The sea level in the U.S. is predicted to rise about 6 inches by 2030. doubling to tripling the risk of a 100-year coastal flood, and to rise 1 foot by 2050 and 3 feet by 2100. Other ocean impacts include acidification, warming with algal blooms, and altered ocean currents. Slide 9. You've likely read about the increased incidence of infectious diseases like malaria with global warming. Dengue is another disease we're worried about. It's a severe flu-like illness, sometimes called breakbone fever, due to its intense joint pain that can progress to a more severe condition called hemorrhagic fever, which can kill. Climate change is increasing the geographic range of the mosquito that carries dengue. West Nile virus is also transmitted by mosquitoes. In severe cases, which are more common in diabetics and older people, this virus invades the nervous system, causing inflammation of the brain and spinal column. There's no treatment, and survivors often have lasting neurological damage. Warmer temps affect mosquitoes. Longer breeding season, shorter time to maturity, faster multiplication of the virus. With warmer weather, you get more mosquitoes that are more likely to bite, and each bite is more likely to result in an infection. Then there's amoebic meningitis. Amoebas enter the nose when swimmers put their heads underwater and follow the olfactory nerves into the brain, which they consume. They're inactive in cold water, and they start reproducing when the water's in the 70s. We're used to seeing this in the warm southern lakes, but now we're finding this meningitis as far north as Minnesota. Slide 10. Moving from the Midwest to the Pacific Northwest, we can measure changes in Oregon. The average temperature in Oregon has become 2 degrees warmer since 1970 with these results. Slide 11. We've heard about this earlier, ozone, a product of combustion of coal here and in Asia, combined with heat and sunlight, comes back to haunt us, just like the mercury referenced by our previous speakers. Slide 12. Exposure to this ozone is associated with lower birth weights in infants and reduced lung capacity in adults. Slide 13. Slide 14. The more coal is burned and the warmer the weather, the more ozone is produced. At ground level, ozone acts as a respiratory irritant, causing cough and sore throat, worsening of asthma and emphysema, increased emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and deaths. Asthma rates have doubled since 1980. The areas of highest ozone are the areas of highest incidence of asthma. Kids playing 3 or more sports have 3 times the risk of asthma. 40% of Americans live in areas with ozone levels already deemed unsafe by the EPA. And by 2050, increased temperatures will cause 12 million additional episodes of severe respiratory symptoms. Slide 15. Slide 16. Burning fossil fuels is the greatest source of pollution. This is what we don't want here or in Asia. Slide 17. Let's turn now from air to water, as do the pollutants created by burning of coal in Asia. Nitrogen deposition is a byproduct of the combustion of coal and can lead to eutrophication and nasty algal blooms in lakes and oceans. Also, warmer oceans can promote algal blooms like red tides. These produce toxins that concentrate up the food chain into shellfish and large fish. The toxins, which cannot be inactivated by cooking, cause abdominal cramps, diarrhea, dangerous drops in heart rate and blood pressure, and neurological symptoms. Severe cases can cause complete paralysis and death from asphyxiation. Slide 18. So we've reviewed some of the human health impacts of climate change. And what's the forecast? Is it too late to do anything? Absolutely not. Many of us have come to think of climate change as a chronic disease. We can't cure it, but we can control it. The difference between uncontrolled and controlled diabetes, for example, is the difference between kidney failure, amputations, heart disease, and death, or leading a long and healthy life. That's a huge difference. But we need to start treatment immediately. We need to get off of coal, the most toxic of all fossil fuels. Here's some of what's going on in Oregon. Slide 19. 150 physicians and over 180 other public health advocates are standing up in Oregon. This is in addition to the 200 physicians Steve referred to in Washington State. Here's a letter we delivered to our governor on their behalf. It voices concerns about local impacts and the blowback of mercury and calls for a health impact assessment and an environmental impact statement. Slide 20. So what is an HIA? It's a systematic process that uses an array of data sources and analytical methods and considers input from stakeholders to determine the potential effects of a proposed policy, plan, program, or project on the health of a population and the distribution of those effects within the population. HIA provides recommendations on monitoring and managing effects. And an HIA can be distinguished from a traditional public health assessment in that it is prospective, focused on informing decisions before they are made. Slide 21. Here's a great resource for you, the Health Impact Project. Slide 22. The values of an HIA include democracy, equity, sustainable development, ethical use of evidence, and a comprehensive approach to health. Slide 23. A bit about the process. The applications are broad and the methods used to analyze impacts are variable, but basic steps described for completing an HIA are consistent. And in our case, what we don't want is a rapid or desktop HIA that can be completed in a period of weeks, but a more comprehensive process that involves public meetings, extensive stakeholder consultation, and collection of new data. In particular, we're interested in baseline and modeling for air quality to look at what's going to happen during inversions, for example, with the transportation of all this coal through our region. Slide 24. In Oregon, there's substantial support for an HIA for coal export proposals. The cities of Portland, Milwaukee, and Eugene have passed resolutions calling for a comprehensive HIA and EISs. And the Yakima Nation and the state's Environmental Justice Task Force have weighed in on the need for the same. I'm not sure whether this was referenced earlier, but there are three of the 5 proposed coal export facilities are in Oregon. 3 of the 5 are in Oregon, 2 are in Washington State. Slide 25. The original group calling for coal export HIAs and EISs came from, is Whatcom Docks, and it's now expanded to become Whatcom and Skagit County Docks. As Steve said earlier, they've called for an HIA and scoping comments submitted for the proposed Cherry Point export terminal, which would be the largest coal export terminal in North America. The comment period closed yesterday. And I recommend that you read their comments at this site, Coal Train Facts. Slide 26. This is the first reference to climate change that we've heard from a while from our president. It came on January 21st, and his words were very welcome. At Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, we're using the knowledge, tools, and voice of the medical community to build a movement to respond to climate change and global warming. We know that our failure to do so would betray our children and future generations. I want to send out a huge thanks to all of you who are working to identify and prevent these grave threats to public health and to our precious planet. Thank you. And final slide, these are the folks who've helped put the presentation together.
Thank you, Regna, for sharing what people are doing in the Pacific Northwest and for reminding us that the health consequences of increased coal export are not limited to those living near mining areas and transportation routes, but truly can affect us on a global scale, and that it is affecting us on a global scale. At this time, I'd again like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, and we would now like to open the lines for your questions and comments. If you would like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please state your name and affiliation, and given how short we are in time relative to the fact that there were 3 presentations and a lot of information covered, we ask that you please be brief so that we can field several questions. Thank you so much. Again, you would press star 2 to unmute your line. And once you do so, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Bill Leedy in Juneau. I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
For any of the speakers, consider the problem that if a coal industry facility of some kind, either mining or transportation, becomes established in a particular location and jurisdiction, that there will be the lobbying aspects of that economic presence, and therefore the importance of preventing at the earliest possible stage the establishment of such an industry. I'd like to hear from your speakers, who are wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this is Regna. Bobby Kennedy was here in May to talk about the impacts of proposed coal exports through the Pacific Northwest. And he, as usual, gave a very stirring speech, but I would say half of his speech referenced the threat to our democracy. The other half had to do with the effects of coal mining in Appalachia. But it made quite an impression on everyone because there's so much money involved. There's an alliance here for Northwest Alliance for Jobs and Exports. They've spent close to over $850,000 in September alone on ads supporting coal exports. So there's an enormous amount of money on that side, and that's only going to increase once the profits and the money are flowing in from these projects. But we have the treasure, we have the people, and the facts, and so I think we can push back.
This is Steve. I think it's really important to emphasize the true costs of doing this. What are the health-related costs? And the proponents of these activities emphasize jobs and the money coming in, but they do not emphasize what the environmental and human health costs on health are, and what are the long-term issues around sustainability and the true costs of global warming, which this operation would contribute to. So I think we need to continue to pressure the proponents and the regulatory agencies to really look at the overall cost to health and ecological development.
Thank you, Steve. And is there someone else who would like to ask a question?
Hi, this is Heidi with ACAT up in Alaska. I actually have a question for Dr. Gilbert. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So you had a slide kind of in the middle of your presentation, and I believe it was about a port in Washington, and you listed off the increased health effects. It was a number of non-fatal heart attacks and a variety of other things. And I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more information about that. Is this an existing port, or is this a proposed new facility?
This is the port in Seattle and Tacoma. So this is our existing ports. And there's been a lot of work done on the rail and truck transportation that goes in and out of that port, and the running of the diesel engines on these ships. And they've tried to, for example, change the trucks over to reduce diesel emissions from the trucks and try to get the ships so they're plugged in. So this was studies done to support reducing contamination at the existing ports. And this is not, the consequences of putting like the Bellingham port, these big coal terminals in, huge number of ships, and these ships are gigantic. So there's enormous consequences to the coastline and the inlets coming into these areas where the terminals are going to be, and just the number of ship traffics would be enormous. So there's a lot of concern about increased diesel emissions from these ships and the trucks and trains bringing in the material.
Thank you for your question, Heidi, and for your response, Steve. And I'd welcome other questions and comments in the 10 minutes that we have remaining. Again, *2 will unmute your line. and please state your name.
Hello, this is Heidi in Seward, and I had a question about what is known about private wood-burning stoves when people burn coal in them. What are there any known health effects of that due to increasing numbers of people burning coal because of the lower cost of coal?
This is Steve. I don't know of much data on the burning of coal in these stoves. I think that's a really interesting question. I do know there's a lot of concern about wood-burning stoves because of the polyaromatic hydrocarbons that come off the wood and the small particulates and the contamination it creates in local areas like in Washington State here, trying to reduce the number of coal or the burning of wood has been in these old stoves that are not very efficient. It's been a priority for our health agencies. So I imagine the coal burning stove would have potentially even more problems with that, and depending on the vintage of the stove and how efficient it is. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes, this is Mary, early childhood educator. Is it accurate to say that train tracks tend to go through lower income neighborhoods? So if you're going to make an environmental justice remark for children, you could say that children in lower income neighborhoods are more affected by this kind of train transport?
Yes. And that cold-blooded report documents some of that, but in general, that's an environmental justice issue, and the lower economic status and the cheaper property is along these train tracks that are handling the coal. Now, in some ways, this may not always be the case, but in general, like in Seattle area, some of the trains would roll right through the city. But in general, it's cheaper land, and the other thing is it's often along waterways. So any accidents are more serious as far as contamination goes. So there's both the environmental justice issue and who's exposed, and the double whammy of stress from the trains going by, potential accidents on the train tracks or crossing the train tracks, both from pedestrian and vehicle movement across the tracks, as well as the dust that comes off these things, contamination in the home, tracking the dust in the home, and just these people that are lower socioeconomic, they have nutrition issues, all this compounds, and this is just one more huge insult on their ability to thrive and do well in our society.
Good answer. Thank you. Appreciate that.
I'd really recommend taking a look at that cold-blooded report. They did a really nice job on that, looking at the environmental justice issues associated with coal.
This is Bill Eady in Juneau again. I'm a marketing guy by nature. Those of us who would like to convince the public to avoid coal should carry around a bag of lumps of coal to hand out to people so they can handle the stuff. Almost none of us has encountered a lump of coal lately, whereas 100 years ago, almost everybody had touched a lump of coal. So that would help convince people in a very tactile experience that coal is dirty in a number of ways.
And then have them wash their hands after that.
That's right. Thank you.
Well, this is Regna. We coalition members have walked the tracks along the Columbia and picked up coal and coal dust, and are now starting to document the problems that folks in those neighborhoods experience with regard to dust and visibility problems that have led to accidents. So I think it's really important. An HIA can do a lot, but it can't do everything. It's very important to document what's going on now, and I know that often that requires a level of support that is not here yet, but it can start with gathering the coal so that at public hearings you can, when you're told there will be no coal, there is no coal on our existing lines, you can pass the coal out. It has quite an impact on our public hearings here.
A great idea.
Yeah.
We have time, I believe, for one more question. before we wrap up for the day, so I'd invite anyone who has been thinking of asking a question but hasn't done it quite yet. Again, press star 2 to unmute yourself. If you've already asked a question, you can press star 2 to mute yourself again. That'll help to reduce any background noise.
Hi, this is Heather. I'm from Wasilla in Alaska, and I was wondering if anyone could let me know. There's the Wishbone Hill mine near where I live, and they've done a desktop or a rapid health impact assessment, and people are asking for a comprehensive one. But I was wondering if you could let us know what the difference is or how that might help us to better understand. There's actually 3 mines that are proposed, all in a 10 or 12 mile area, and it's very close to home. So they've only done it on one small part of that, the rapid or desktop assessment. So just wondering, how can a health impact assessment help?
Well, this is Regna. They're just completely different animals. Those desktop health impacts are often just literature reviews, and they don't necessarily involve public meetings and stakeholder consultation or collection of new data. And that's really what we need and what we're demanding. They're completely different animals. You'd hope you'd have a baseline of people and groups affected by the decisions, and then could predict the potential health effects and the effects on the local economy, air quality, parks, schools, daycare centers. It should go beyond a literature review to include a deeper analysis and or quantitative modeling. We also would like to see what the distribution of those impacts are among vulnerable subgroups in children, the elderly, people with chronic illnesses, different racial and ethnic groups, or those with low incomes. So the other thing is that the HIA should be conducted in an impartial way that identifies risks and the benefits of potential decisions. That's one of the reasons we've been pushing for an independent comprehensive health impact assessment in Oregon, because we're concerned that if the company that stands to gain by these activities is paying for the HIA, it's going to be a biased outcome.
Well, this is Mary again. Who pays for HIAs? A good comprehensive one.
Could you hear that question? It was a little quiet. The question is, who pays for HIAs?
Well, it could be paid for by various entities. It could be paid for by a foundation. It could be paid for by a state health authority. They could be paid for by a combination of counties, municipalities that are going to be affected by proposals for projects in combination with the state. And they have been, I think, on occasion paid for by the applicants who are proposing the projects.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are out of time for today, but I just have a few announcements before we close. We're holding a special call for nurses on February 6th, so anyone is welcome to join. The call is called Nurses in the Halls of Power, the Why, What, and How of Nurse Advocacy for Safer Chemicals, and you can sign up on our website at akaction.org. And again, I would just like to thank all of you who called in today for your participation. I'd like to remind you that a recording will be available online, and we'll send a link to that probably tomorrow morning. And I'd like to thank our guest presenters again for your important work and for sharing your time today. And finally, just to put in a word, if you value these calls, so please consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics via our secure website at akaction.org. Thank you. And if you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. Again, the number is 907-222-7714. Or you can email Diana at akaction.org. If you think of something that you didn't get a chance to ask, I can liaison with our speakers and get your question answered or put you in touch with them. So thanks again very much, and have a great day.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks to everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.